Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions webinar, Implementing Net Zero Commitments. I am Tom Erb, a policy fellow at C2ES, and I'm pleased to be hosting this conversation with you all today. Thank you first to our panelists for taking the time to be with us. Thank you also to our audience for tuning in and contributing to the discussion. From the entire C2ES team, we want to start by wishing everyone good health and safety during these difficult times. C2ES, as we all have, has been adjusting to our new reality and will continue to find ways to engage on these important issues while also responding to the immediate health crisis. Next slide, please. Joining me on the webinar today are 4 representatives from companies that recently announced a net zero carbon commitment. Sue-Ern is the Group Carbon Relations Manager for Royal Dutch Shell. Sarah is the Public Policy Director for Federal Government and Corporate Affairs at Duke Energy. Bob is the Vice President and Head of US Policy at BP America, and Michelle is the Director of Sustainability Policy at Microsoft. Before we dive into the content, here are a few housekeeping items. We received record turnout for this webinar. With that said, there is a cap to how many people can participate. If you plan to leave the webinar early, please exit to ensure someone else can take your spot. If you step away for a second, keep the webinar open to maintain your spot. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our C2ES YouTube page following this broadcast. And after presentations, we'll have time for audience Q&A. Using your GoToWebinar question box on the right-hand side of your screen, you can submit questions throughout the webinar. And just so our audience is aware, Shell is currently in closed period prior to announcing their Q1 2020 results tomorrow. Sue-Ern will therefore present Shell's climate ambition, but will not answer questions. Thank you for understanding. Next slide, please. I'm going to kick things off with a brief recap of the latest developments in corporate net zero commitments and some background on C2ES. Each panelist will then give a short presentation on the details of their recent net zero commitment. After all presentations are complete, I will lead with a few moderator questions. We will then proceed to audience Q&A. Next slide, please. A little bit about C2ES. We are an independent and nonpartisan nonprofit organization focused on strong policy and action to address climate change. We are known as a convener of stakeholders. That means federal, state, and local governments, as well as corporations and other NGOs, and we produce publications on topics including carbon pricing, climate resilience, and international climate negotiations. I encourage you to check out our website, c2es.org, where you can find our reports, upcoming events, blogs, and more. Next slide, please. One of our unique features is that we have a Business Environmental Leadership Council, or BELC as we call it. The BELC includes 37 top companies across diverse sectors, and Shell, Duke Energy, BP, and Microsoft are all members. It is one of the largest US-based group of companies devoted solely to addressing climate change. And a lot of the stakeholder work that we do involves engaging this group of companies to move the needle on climate change. Next slide, please. For example, in 2018, C2ES launched an initiative, Climate Innovation 2050, to serve as a vehicle for exploring mid-century carbon neutrality in the US. Over the last few years, we've worked closely with companies to develop a set of alternative scenarios and various policy documents, including Getting to Zero, a US climate agenda, which outlined key policies needed over the next decade to put the US on a path to net zero. The report includes a section on what businesses can do to accelerate the transition. C2ES is also conducting research and convening in-depth discussions with businesses on best practices to reduce supply chain emissions. And if you tuned into our webinar earlier this month, you know C2ES has been working hard with partner companies on climate-related disclosures. Next slide, please. We've seen several recent developments related to corporate climate action. The Paris Agreement, pressure from shareholders, investors, and customers, and opportunities in the low-carbon transition are driving companies to shift their business models towards a low-carbon pathway. In the last year, and just in the last few months, we have seen more major companies committing to net zero carbon emissions. However, they are leaders in their sectors, as only a small number of companies have committed to net zero by at least 2050. These new commitments vary by timeline, emission scopes, and implementation strategies, and they build on existing goals. In today's webinar, we will learn what these commitments include, why they're being made now, and what the implementation roadmap could look like. We'll hear about the different challenges that companies face with their unique business models and value chains. For example, We will learn how companies are engaging to reduce emissions beyond their immediate control. This includes working with suppliers and end users to address difficult to decarbonize Scope 3 emissions, launching new investments into carbon removal and reduction technologies, and engaging in policy advocacy. Success will require extensive internal coordination, but also support from and collaboration with customers, civil society, and government at all levels. Now to our main event. Next slide, please. We're going to start the presentations today with Sue-Ern, the Group Carbon Relations Manager at Royal Dutch Shell. Sue-Ern, please proceed with your presentation.
Thanks very much, Tom, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening. If you're like me and you're based in Europe at the moment, good evening, everyone. I do hope that everyone and their families are staying safe and well in these challenging times. Next slide, please. So before I go any further, let me highlight, as you can imagine, the disclaimer statement that I'm obliged to share. Next slide, please. So, thank you again for the opportunity to share with you today Shell's climate ambition, which we recently announced. So even at a time of immediate challenge, it is important to also keep an eye on the long term as well. And for Shell, the biggest long-term question is the one raised by climate change. And abandoning that focus in the face of urgent short-term needs will only make the long-term challenges all the harder to tackle when today's challenges are no longer with us. So in tackling climate change, society's focus is increasingly on limiting the global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And Shell supports this ambition. The IPCC scenarios, consistent with the 1.5 degrees Celsius future, point towards a need for the world to stop adding to the stock of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, a state that's known as net zero emissions, in the second half of this century. While some parts of the world may take longer to get to that goal, many economies will need to act faster. Some have already announced ambitions to get there by 2050 or sooner if possible. Shell recognizes that it stands within a section of society that needs to move faster. And that is why we have set an ambition to become a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 or sooner if that's possible. We will work towards this ambition in three interrelated ways. Firstly, we've set a new ambition to be net zero on all the emissions from all our operations by 2050 at the latest. This ambition includes the emissions created by our operations and also those associated with the energy we consume. It includes the emissions from the production of our non-energy products like chemicals and lubricants. Now, these are excluded from our net carbon footprint ambition because they are not burned when used. But the bulk of the emissions are our customers' emissions when they use our energy products. And that is why Shell's second step towards being a net zero emissions energy business is to reduce the carbon intensity of the energy products we sell, in step with society as it moves towards the goals of the Paris Agreement. And this is what we call our net carbon footprint ambition. Now, how we calculate it hasn't changed from when we announced the ambition back in November 2017. It's still about emitting fewer greenhouse gases on average with each unit of energy we sell. But going forward, we have significantly raised our net carbon footprint ambition so that it's in step with the large sections of society that want to achieve a 1.5 degrees Celsius future. So Shell's long-term ambition is now to reduce the net carbon footprint of the energy products we sell by 65% by 2050 instead of 50%. And our medium-term ambition is to reduce the net carbon footprint of our energy products by 30% by 2035 instead of 20%. Finally, to achieve our ambition, we must also help our customers decarbonize. And that is the third step Shell must take if it is to become a net zero emissions energy business. This means working with our customers to address the emissions which are produced when they use the fuels they buy from Shell. It also includes working with broad coalitions of businesses, governments, and other parties, sector by sector, to identify and enable viable decarbonization pathways for each sector. and it may be through actions others take themselves, or Shell may agree to find a way to mitigate unavoidable emissions on our customers' behalf. So, it's one new overarching climate ambition: to be a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. This includes a new goal to tackle emissions from all of our operations that bring our products to customers, as well as significantly raising our net carbon footprint ambition to transform the mix of energy products we sell over time. And it necessitates working even more intensely with customers and supply chains to help them decarbonize energy use sector by sector. Becoming a net zero emissions energy business by 2050 means that our business plans need to change in line with expectations of society and our customers. We aim to pivot towards serving the businesses and sectors that are net zero emissions by 2050, and we become an integral part of the future net zero world. Next slide, please. Of course, it's easy to state an ambition, and it's harder to achieve it. We're talking about a fundamental shift for Shell over the next 30 years. And this is going to take a lot of work. Shell stands ready to contribute to bringing about a net zero carbon economy, to innovate, to invest, to produce new products and create new markets. But we cannot act alone. As a founding member of the Mission Possible platform, we have already started working with energy use sectors to help them optimize the decarbonization of their demand, including signing up to related sectoral initiatives in aviation and shipping. So those are the Clean Skies for Tomorrow initiative, which aims to align on a transition to sustainable aviation fuels as part of a meaningful and proactive pathway for the aviation industry to achieve carbon neutral flying. And the Global Maritime Forum's Getting to Zero Coalition, which is working towards the ambitious goal of getting commercially viable zero emissions vessels into operation along deep sea trade routes by 2030. We're also actively engaging with our customers in other key sectors such as passenger and heavy duty road transport, chemicals, and heavy industry. We want to help develop sectoral roadmaps to net zero, with energy users and suppliers both taking concrete action towards this future enabled by a supportive policy environment. Such initiatives are essential to effective climate action. But it's important to note that Shell's business plans today will not get us to where we want to be. And that means our business plans have to change over time as society and our customers also change. And it's in this way, by changing, that Shell can succeed in becoming a net zero emissions energy business by 2050. And if Shell can succeed in this ambition, we will truly have succeeded in being an integral part of a net zero world. There is no more ambition that we can have than to be a core part of the future that society wants and needs. And that is what being a net zero emissions energy business means to Shell. That is what we now intend to do, and we will work with our customers so that we can achieve it together. So again, thank you for this opportunity for sharing Shell's carbon ambition with you. I wish for each of you to keep staying safe and well in these challenging times. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you very much, Sue-Ern. Very helpful overview, and it's great to hear about the new recent commitment and goals. So thank you very much. We're going to proceed now to Sarah, who is the Public Policy Director for Federal Government and Corporate Affairs at Duke Energy. Sarah, take it away.
Thanks, Tom, and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here today and part of this important and exciting conversation, and especially so as these types of virtual engagements take on a whole new meaning for us as we're all working to make progress on our strategic and long-term goals as we also navigate the challenges that are immediately in front of us with COVID-19. I want to start by acknowledging, for those of you who were closely following the advertised program for this conversation, as I'm sure many of you were, that I am in fact not Vicki Sullivan, who leads our climate policy and was originally scheduled to address you today, but I will do my best to fill her very big shoes in this conversation. To give you a sense of where I have been throughout this journey for Duke Energy and where I'm coming from, as we're talking about the development and implementation of these goals, I was sitting in a North Carolina focused role through the development of these goals and now have an enterprise-wide view as we're looking at implementation. So first, before I jump in, just some background on Duke Energy. We operate regulated electric utilities in 6 states, North and South Carolina, Florida, Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. We also operate gas distribution companies in 5 states and a commercial renewables business that has invested over about $5 billion across the U.S. in wind, solar, and energy storage projects in the past 10 years. Slide 2, please. Jumping in here, Duke Energy announced in September of last year new and ambitious climate aspirations for our electric utilities, the 6 regulated jurisdictions that I just mentioned, and those include a goal of achieving net zero by 2050 and at least 50% below 2005 levels by 2030. I won't go too much into the question of why here. Tom teed that up in his opening remarks, and maybe we can explore more of that in our discussion. But I will say that in setting these goals, we believe it's the right thing to do for our customers and for our business. In announcing our goals, we recognize that this path will evolve over time, but that there were some key components that we knew would be critical to our success. And those were first and foremost collaborating and aligning with our states and stakeholders as we transform. So Duke Energy has been adapting and evolving as a company for more than a century, and rising to this challenge will require us to continue to adapt and evolve, but also to collaborate and to recognize that the differences in the states that we serve. However, we know that across the company, we need to accelerate our investments in cleaner energy solutions, and we need to modernize the grid to support those clean energy investments. We also know that continuing to safely operate our existing nuclear fleet will be critical. Duke Energy has 11,000 megawatts of existing nuclear generation, which provides 24/7 zero carbon power today. And last but not least, we know that we'll need to be proactive in advocating for policy that advances technology innovation to make this vision possible. Next slide. So where do we stand today? Between 2005 and 2019, the company reduced its carbon dioxide emissions by 39%, putting us on track to achieve our 2030 target of at least 50%. We've retired 51 coal units since 2010, totaling about 6.5 gigawatts, and we have plans to retire almost another gigawatt by 2024, and we've proposed to accelerate the depreciation of another 7 gigawatts in regulatory proceedings in North Carolina and Indiana. As of year-end 2019, we owned or contracted about 8 gigawatts of renewables. And in our most recent sustainability report, which was released just yesterday, we are establishing a new goal to approximately double that amount to 16 gigawatts by the end of 2025. Just as important, we've also been a clear leader in the Southeast in energy efficiency for many years. Our Carolinas utilities have consistently topped the Southern Alliance for Clean Energy's annual review of top utility programs in the region, and we see continued investments in energy efficiency as key to meeting our goals going forward. Next slide. So as we look forward, I'm excited to say that just yesterday, Duke Energy published an updated climate report alongside our annual sustainability report. And that climate report discusses in more detail how we as a company are really leaning into this challenge and the opportunities and complexities ahead as we continue down this really, truly exciting path. In the report, we analyzed an illustrative pathway to 2050, which provides an enterprise-wide view of what this transition could look like and additional insights into the steps we'll need to take to achieve net zero. Again, recognizing the path will adapt and evolve over time, and it will look different in each of our states. I won't dig in on the details on that report. It covers a lot of ground, but I do want to highlight one key takeaway from that analysis, and that is this. We see a clear path to 2030 with the tools that we have in our toolbox today, if you will, but by 2035, in addition to adding commercially available renewables and storage at an unprecedented pace, continuing to operate our existing nuclear fleet, utilizing natural gas and retiring coal, we will likely need new advanced technologies that are not commercially available today to continue driving emissions out of our system. At Duke Energy, we've come to refer to those technologies as zero-emitting load-following resources, or ZELFRs for short. And we talk a bit about them in the report that was released yesterday. In general, these are technologies that are very low or zero emitting and are dispatchable to meet electricity demand, providing that reliable power that our customers expect and deserve. And they could include things like advanced nuclear, carbon capture utilization and storage, very low or zero carbon fuels like hydrogen, which we're hearing a lot about lately, and long duration energy storage technologies, so storage that shifts energy not just for hours, but days, weeks, months, or even seasons. And we see the significant need for ZELFR technology, as we see the significant need for ZELFR technologies, I would be remiss if I didn't also emphasize that we also see advanced nuclears like offshore wind and new flexibilities in demand as critical as well. So we're thinking comprehensively as we look at the tools that we're going to need in that proverbial toolbox. So time is of the essence, and supporting this innovation will be a big focus for us going forward, in addition to making strong progress with the technology that is available today. And we're looking at collaborations with entities like the Electric Power Research Institute, Gas Technology Institute, Edison Electric Institute, and nonprofits like C2ES to help us build that path forward. So with that intro, Tom, I will turn it back to you and look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Sarah. I appreciate that overview, and we'll certainly circle back to some of those key questions during the moderator and probably the Q&A as well. And I will say right off the bat that I love the ZELFRs reference. I'm going to be using that moving forward. So let's transition now to BP, and we'll have Bob speaking. Bob is the Vice President and Head of U.S. Policy at BP America. Bob, take it away.
Hi, thank you very much, Tom. And like everybody else, I just hope everybody is safe and well. And I just want to say how impressive it is. We have, looks like the full max of 501 attendees in this session. And I really want to thank Tom and his colleagues at C2ES at a time when we're all dealing with challenging things at the moment, to gather such an impressive group of panelists, and I'm honored to be part of it. And also so many people to talk about this really important issue looking forward. Next slide. So what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the purpose and the ambition and the aims that BP announced in February, and then also talk a little bit about how those are meaningful to us even today as we go forward. So in February, we announced a new purpose, and we announced that we'd be a more purposeful company, and this would inform everything we do, and that is reimagining energy for people and our planet. And that obviously has really profound implications for everything that we do. Providing the world with clean, reliable, affordable energy is going to require nothing less than really reimagining the energy system. You see that in Sue-Ern's presentation, and we very much feel the same. Part of that also is reinventing BP. We have moved away from the traditional upstream, downstream organization to a new organization that's more consumer focused and more focused on low carbon. I won't get into detail on that, but it's an important enabler for our achieving that purpose. Next slide, please. And so to reach that purpose, we've set the ambition for BP to become a net zero company by 2050 or sooner, and to help the world get to net zero. And that is obviously a large ambition, and it's underpinned by 10 aims. On your left here, you'll see 5 aims, which are focused on helping us become a net zero company. I'm not going to go through all of these, don't worry, but I will cover some of the major ones that I want to highlight, and we can talk more about others in Q&A as appropriate. On the right, though, are 5 aims to help the world meet net zero. And I'm not going to cover those in any detail, but I do want to say that particularly as somebody who works on policy, both on our global policy development and also how we implement that here in the US, I think this is really important, because for our industry and for the world and for this country to reach net zero, we need to be advocating for policies like carbon pricing that will help do that. We need to align our associations to the best extent that we can, et cetera. So I think those are also important. But what I'd like to do is spend a few minutes on the first three aims we have here with respect to our CO2 emissions. So the first one, aim one, is to be net zero on an absolute basis across our entire operations by 2050 or sooner. And those are standard scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that includes both our own emissions as well as those that go into our operations, such as electricity emissions from that as well. So that is obviously a very significant ambition in itself. In 2019, just for reference, our operational emissions were approximately 55 million tons. And so that's aim one, but I'm going to talk in more detail in a minute about aim two. But this one is extremely important, and that is to be net zero on an absolute basis across our upstream production. That's the oil and gas we produce, or the equity share of that, by 2050 or sooner. And I'm going to come to more detail on that one in a second. The third one is having the intensity of the products we sell by 2050 or sooner. And to explain the difference between aim 3 and aim 2, aim 3 recognizes the fact that we sell vastly more energy than just what we produce. Aim 2 focuses on the upstream that we produce. Aim 3 focuses on all that we sell. So for example, we sell 3 times more natural gas than we produce, and some of you may know we are actually the largest seller of gas in North America. And I'm not going to go through all the other ambitions, but happy to talk about them. Obviously, aim 4 with respect to methane is important, and I'll just mention there, that aim includes installing measurement, actual measurement of methane emissions at all of our major sites by 2023, and then publishing that and driving further reductions. As some of you may know, methane emissions now tend to be measured mostly, or not measured, but mostly based upon emissions factors. So we're going to really focus on measuring those. Next slide, please. So this is aim 2, which I said I was going to talk about a little bit more. And again, this is net zero on an absolute basis across the carbon if burned in our upstream oil and gas production by 2050 or sooner. And so this is a scope 3 and a scope 3 aim. And Tom talked about the difficult to decarbonize scope 3 emissions. This will certainly be a challenging ambition, but it's a major one. And we measure this based on our equity production, based on the net share of production, excluding BP's share of Rosneft, where we have just a stock holding. And we've chosen that equity boundary because it's aligned with how we report our upstream production. Now, at the bottom of the slide, you'll see some of the key levers that can help us achieve this goal. It's important to realize when we look at any of these potential levers over the next discussion, that they're just possibilities, and I'm sure that there are others. But obviously, there's portfolio management, which is where and how much oil and gas we're producing and the carbon content of that. Carbon capture, utilization, and storage is absolutely critical under any scenario for getting the world to net zero, and it's obviously important for our aim as well. Blue hydrogen, natural gas with CCUS is important, and last but not least is natural climate solutions. Those also will play an important role, although I think it's also important to say that can only be one piece of the puzzle, and it's extremely important that those natural climate solutions, or offsets as sometimes people call them, have strong validity and support and quantification, meeting strict standards behind them. So I just want to sort of end by saying here how important it is that even in the time of COVID, we have announced that we are going to continue with these aims, ambitions, and purpose. And our CEO recently said, even in the context of, we did just announce our earnings and what was obviously a brutal quarter, that this has never been more important than ever. And it informs everything we do, including something we announced today, which is one of the things we're doing for the COVID response is we're supplying 3 million gallons of jet fuel to FedEx, charter flights, and Alaska Airlines to help them make sure they can timely deliver personal protective equipment and so on. And we are offsetting the carbon emissions from those donated fuel deliveries through a program we have called Target Neutral that is also in cooperation with Flora and Fauna International. So it has to inform everything we do, but society expects us to be purpose-driven and not just profit-driven, frankly. And I think what we're going through now underscores the importance of that. And so while we need to focus on the near term and it's a challenging time for all of us, I think it's also key that we focus on the long term. And thanks again for the opportunity to review this and the discussion today.
Thanks, Bob. Really appreciate it. Really helpful overview, and hopefully we can touch on those first three, but also the rest of the interesting commitments you all have there in the Q&A session. So thanks a lot. We're going to close the presentations today with Michelle. Michelle is the Director of Sustainability Policy at Microsoft. Michelle, take it away.
Thank you, Tom, and let me just congratulate Sue-Ern and Sarah and Bob for those remarkable goals that your organizations have set. I want to start by letting everyone know that our thoughts are with you and your family during these challenging times, and really thank you for all that your organizations and your companies and your governments are doing to address COVID-19 and particularly provide relief to those communities across the country and around the world that really need it. Microsoft is very focused on COVID-19. We also continue to work on our other top corporate priorities, which involve sustainability and climate. And Microsoft has been working on climate for the last 10 years. We've been very focused, proud of our achievements, but the science is telling us that we all need to do more. And so if we go to the next slide, you'll see that in January, Microsoft took the next step in its journey. We announced our moonshot, which is for Microsoft to be carbon negative by 2030. And that involves our scope 1, which is our direct operations, our scope 2, which is our electricity generation, and our scope 3, which is both our upstream and downstream supply chain, what goes into our products, but also what our customers use when they're using our products. And then we'll keep going until we remove all the historic carbon emissions that Microsoft has put into the atmosphere since we were founded as a company in 1975, and we'll do that by 2050. And then we announced separately a new capital fund of $1 billion to put to work to really help advance technology in this space. And if you go to the next slide, when we take on any task like this, we try to start with principles that ground us. And the 6 principles that we have developed to help us execute this moonshot are to first take responsibility for our own footprint, including our supply chain. The second is to fund investment for better carbon reduction and removal technologies. Well, some technologies exist today, some are not necessarily scalable or commercially available, and some still need to be developed. We want to support and empower both our suppliers and our customers around the world to do more. Our 4th principle is on transparency, and we want to be transparent in what we're doing. So we were transparent during our announcement in what our footprint was, and we'll continue to disclose how we are achieving progress against our goal. We will use our voice in climate-related policy advocacy across the United States and around the world. And we will also really tap into the huge benefit we have of our employees, the passion that they have about these issues and the expertise that they bring, both from their existing jobs at Microsoft, but their own backgrounds. If we go to the next slide, we can unpack a little bit more what those targets mean. So we'll be carbon negative by 2030. As I said, that includes our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3. In order to get there, we will drive our scope 1 and 2 emissions to near zero by 2025. In ways such as having 100% renewable contracts for all our data centers, our campuses, and our buildings around the world, electrifying the fleets that we own across our campuses, but also the commuter fleets, which help many of our employees in some of our bigger campuses get from their homes to their offices, and in what we do in our buildings, in how net zero buildings and doing more on the embodied carbon piece. And then on scope 3, we will reduce that to 55% by 2030. So that gets us to about a half reducing our scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 by half, and then we will remove the rest. So we will be procuring removals both in the near term in nature-based solutions, making sure they're verifiable if it's an afforestation or reforestation, and also soil investments. And then down the road, when those engineered solutions become more widely available, being able to do those removals through direct air captures and other technologies. And then we'll keep going, and we'll keep going until we have gotten our removed all of the collective sum that reflects our historic emissions directly or through our electricity consumption since our founding in 1975. And let me go back to scope 3 for a second. So this involves getting our scope 3 to 55%. And as it's been talked about before, scope 3 is quite challenging. One, you don't control it, and two, it's hard to even get your hands around what that is. And so the first steps that we've taken in this is that we are going to be applying Microsoft's carbon fee. Right now, that is charged to our scope 1, scope 2, and our employee travel. We're going to be applying our carbon fee to our supply chain. And then we're also going to be providing information and measures to help our suppliers in the near term begin to help them quantify and then eventually reduce their carbon emissions so that we can achieve our goals that we've set out. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk a little bit more about our $1 billion Climate Innovation Fund. So as I mentioned, this is $1 billion of new capital that Microsoft is putting to work over the next few years, really to help the development of technologies for carbon reduction and removal. And we'll be doing that through investing in project and debt finance. We'll be doing that through either equity and debt capital and investing in new innovations. There'll be some grants that's done to academics and nonprofits. But the overall goal here is really to take those technologies from the lab to the market and really scale up the innovation and technology development that many of my colleagues have talked about earlier today. So this is our moonshot. We know it's going to take a lot of Microsoft, but really more importantly, it's going to take us working together with all of you, with our customers, with our suppliers, with our organizations and governments around the world to really achieve it. So thank you for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Michelle. That was a helpful overview, and it's always great to hear about the innovative carbon pricing program. As someone who has been working on that, carbon pricing generally, it's always great to hear about the work you're doing there and how you plan to use it moving forward. So now we're going to proceed to the moderated question and answer portion of the webinar. As a reminder, you can submit your questions at any time using the GoToWebinar question box, and we'll get to audience questions shortly. And just as a quick summary of what we just heard, we heard our panelists talk about what net zero means to them, including Shell's approach to net zero carbon footprint, which includes the emissions from the products its customers use. We heard why they are doing this, including Microsoft's recognition of the urgency of the challenge and the importance of empowering their customers to be a part of the solution. We heard how they're operationalizing these commitments, including BP's commitment to establishing methane monitoring at all its sites by 2023 and working to reduce those emissions. And we also heard some of the big challenges, including Duke Energy's reference to needing new technologies, or ZELFers, to advance and be commercialized to reach net zero. So I want to dive a little deeper into these questions. And to start, this question's for all panelists. I really want to get a definition of what net zero means to you and to your company. And I'm going to start with you, Sarah, and I would specifically like to ask about what the role of offsets, carbon capture, and direct air capture will be in your approach to net zero. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. Great question. I guess I would say first off the bat, with respect to carbon capture, as I mentioned in our opening my most opening remarks, that we see carbon capture as a potential sulfur technology and one that we should be focused on. I think we heard BP and Shell talk about the importance of that technology in their industry, and we absolutely see potential in our industry as well. But the larger point I want to make to your very good question is that as we think about the role of offsets, we're really focused on driving emissions first and foremost out of our system. And so as we think about what net zero means, we're recognizing that as we get closer to 2050, there are very likely to be hard to reduce emissions that are residual to our system. Think about applying carbon capture technologies or having some amount of natural gas on the system that's there to really provide a balancing role in limited circumstances where needed. And so it's not an offset first approach that we're taking, where we're really focused on how do we drive those emissions out of the system, and recognizing that we may need, as was mentioned earlier, markets for reliable offsets as we get closer to that 2050 timeframe.
Thanks, Sarah. Michelle or Bob, do you want to add to the question of what net zero means specifically to your company?
So I'm happy to jump in here. I think that, as I mentioned, it's really getting it down to as close to zero as we can, and then removing it, because there's this idea. It's not just about balance, right? But we've also been putting carbon emissions into the atmosphere for the last decades and frankly century, and it stays there for a very, very long time. So we have to deal both with the things that we're putting into it, getting that to zero, but also recognizing that there's a lot that's still there that needs to come out. And so that's what comes to our net zero, but really our carbon negative piece. And we've been carbon neutral for a long time, and have focused purchasing a lot of different projects and a lot of different offsets. And I think we're making the shift now that it really needs to be much more verifiable on carbon removal, at least for us, to be able to get to that balance that I talked about, that you're basically dealing with all the emissions that have both been in the atmosphere, but making sure that you're not putting any new net emissions into it.
Yeah, so this is Bob. I think that's very well said, and I like the way that Sarah positioned the natural climate solutions and offsets. I think that has to be part of the picture, but it's obviously, I guess, sort of to do a little bit of a advertisement for the Climate Innovation 2050 work. It really shows that we're going to need all of these levers. We're going to need many different technologies, and that's why blue hydrogen is an important thing that we're working on, and even green hydrogen, things like BECCS. We're going to need a lot of those things, but I do want to particularly point to CCUS. A number of you will be familiar with the National Petroleum Council report that just came out about that. Every analysis shows how important it is, and a lot of that is about actually getting those projects going at scale. And one good example where we're doing that, we working with Shell and others through the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, is in the UK at a project called Teesside, where we're BP will be operating, and we're going to be installing CCUS in a power plant and in an industrial area, where hopefully we can use it also to decarbonize other industries. So I think getting that scaled up is going to be extremely important, but all of the things you've mentioned need to be part of the solution. And I think if you're serious, as obviously all of us are, as companies and as part of industries and the planet, of getting there, you have to be open to and trying to innovate across all of them.
Great, thanks, Bob and Michelle. That's really helpful explanation. So my next question relates to, more specifically, why you all are doing this. And this is to all panelists again. We understand the urgency of the climate challenge. We understand these targets are necessary to put the world on a path to carbon neutrality by 2050. But I'm curious if there's also a business case for these targets. Does your company see a business opportunity by being leaders in this space? Are there additional drivers? I'm thinking about investors, employee pressure, customers. And Bob, I'll start with you, because you were talking a little bit about this. So I'll stop there, and then we'll open it up to the other speakers as well.
Thank you, Tom. That is a really important point and a good question, because I think for this to be credible, it's important for people within our companies, but also the broader community, to understand that this does make business sense. And the first thing about all of this is, so how do you get to this commitment? And it's a realization. It's sort of getting it that, as you say, we're not on a sustainable path, and societal, customer, employee, investor, stakeholder expectations are that we need to help them solve this problem. And as our CEO has said, even with COVID, this crisis has really helped make it clear that the world in which we're just, our sole objective is to maximize profit, that's no longer acceptable. People expect us to take all that into account. We need to change. And so there's huge risk. If you are a long-term enterprise, as we are, and want to remain in business, there's huge risk by not taking these steps. We need to. But I also think it's really important, and we talk about this a lot within BP, to focus on the opportunity side of this. It will require a profound transformation, but it also creates, I mean, we are already involved at scale in wind and in solar. And interestingly, a couple weeks ago, as our CEO recently pointed out, during these very, very tough economic times, our Lightsource BP joint venture announced 400 megawatts of new contracts for solar in the United States. It will take some time to scale it up, to scale up the renewables, but it's also happening. It is happening. And then you know, just across electrification can present opportunities. We're involved in Europe in a major charging station venture. So there are going to be many, many business opportunities. And just the last thing I want to say in that regard is, I think this is why organizational change is important, so you can identify and work with customers. And a number of those customers actually are going to be regions and cities. So we just recently, for example, came out and supported the Houston Climate Action Plan. And there's great opportunity, I think, for businesses that become solution oriented and think about integrated offers, integrating low carbon solutions into a package to work with others and actually create those opportunities. And those are the opportunities that are going to be there for our industry in the future, and we want to be part of that.
And then this is Michelle. I would just jump in to say that there are many drivers for action. You know, I think first and foremost, it really does start with the science and the math, which is telling us that we all need to act, and those who can do more must. And that's why we've set these bold goals. But at the same time, our organization's mission is to empower every individual and organization on this planet to achieve more. And we're hearing from our customers that they want help, that they want partnerships in helping them achieve their own carbon and their own sustainability goals. We obviously hear a lot about it from our employees who are passionate about these issues, and they want to work for organizations that match their own values. And from investors, and you know, to Bob's point, our customers are not just private sector customers, they're also public sector customers that are looking for solutions and looking for partnerships. So I think this is all around. Both there's an urgency there, but there's a tremendous amount of you know, business and partnership opportunities.
Yeah, and this is Sarah. I think Bob and Michelle articulated that really well. I'll just echo their points. Absolutely, we see opportunities with renewables, storage, energy efficiency, grid modernization, you know, the electric sector helping to decarbonize other sectors like transportation through electrification. And to the second part of the question, yes, we absolutely consider the interests of a wide range of stakeholders in setting these goals, not least among them customers of all sizes, residential customers, many of our municipal customers who have goals of their own, large energy users, some of which, like Microsoft, have ambitious climate goals, others which are very price sensitive. You know, what are we hearing from our investors, our employees, environmental organizations, and other members of the communities that we work with on a day-to-day basis? So I think there are a lot of drivers and a lot of opportunities and risks to manage against, risks of inaction, and all of that went into our thinking and continues to drive how we're thinking about achieving these goals.
Great, thanks a lot. That's really helpful. I want to dive a little deeper now into operationalizing these commitments. So if any of you could speak in a little bit more detail about what steps in the near, medium, or long term that you'll need to take to be on track to meet these goals, right? So we kind of think about in large, general terms about what the commitment is in the long time frame, but what does this actually look like on the ground for your company in the future? And Michelle, I'll start with you.
Sure, and let me break this down. I mean, for us, it starts with, you know, scope 1 and scope 2, which is our operations and our electricity. And so to order really get that to near zero, we've set a goal to get 100% contracts for our renewable energy, solar, wind, and hydro for our data centers, campuses all around the world by 2025. And that's really only 5 years from now. So that's pretty near term. And then electrifying our vehicle fleet and especially, you know, zero carbon buildings for our new constructions that are happening in Puget Sound and elsewhere. So those are really operational goals that are now being built into our business plans for the next few years. And then the second piece is really with our supply chain. As I had mentioned, we're looking to get that to 55% cut by 2030. And so the first piece of that is going to be extending our carbon fee to our supply chain. It's not going to be directly to our suppliers. It's going to be through the businesses that procure those products. So we are doing that, and then later this year we're going to be rolling out some guidelines on how we engage our suppliers to help them on this journey. So I think those are the near-term operational things that we are looking at to be able to achieve our carbon negative goal.
This is Sarah. I'll jump in. I think I
go ahead.
I think I touched on some of this in my opening remarks, but as we think about the steps that we need to take over the near term, I would look to our long-term planning processes in each of our states, and we're thinking about how do we build a glide path toward that 2050 goal. And as we're working through those planning processes that we go through on a biannual or every couple of years, depending on the state. And I think, we're looking at how do we accelerate renewables and storage? How do we retire coal? We know we're going to need to continue to use natural gas in order to retire the coal that's remaining on our system, pairing that with renewables and storage. I mentioned our existing nuclear fleet. One thing that we did the day after we announced this goal was also to announce that we were going to be seeking second relicenses for our existing nuclear fleet, knowing that those were going to be important out into the future. Looking for ways to ramp up customer programs, energy efficiency, demand side management programs that give us more flexible loads to pair with renewables and storage. But as I talked about the technology innovation, and Bob hit on this really well too, we talk about needing new technologies in 2035. That's really right around the corner from us, for a planning perspective. And so we're going to be looking for ways in the near term for how do we as a company engage to make sure that those technologies are coming from the lab to demonstration to commercial deployment, so that they're there for us when we need them, really in the blink of an eye from a planning perspective. So that's going to be really important to our focus.
And I'll just add briefly, I think those are all good points. And I touched on some of the things that we've been doing, but I did want to point out that, we announced this in February, and in September, we'll be having a Capital Markets Day where we'll be offering a lot more specifics on our strategies around and on also nearer term targets and so on to achieve this. I think Michelle used the term moonshot, and as an oil and gas company, to say you're going to be net zero by 2050, and particularly on everything that you pull out of the ground, your oil and gas production is quite ambitious. We're definitely in action on a number of these things. We're continuing to also invest. Even during these very tough times, as our CEO pointed out, we had committed to $500 million a year in those renewable energy and low carbon investments, and we're going to continue with that. And in the past, we've done even more. So I think there's just sort of for all of us. I think it's Patricia Espinosa said that following COVID, this is an opportunity, or as the economies come out of this, to try to rebuild better. And I think we need to think about that as a company. And there are lots of opportunities around digitalization to do that, many opportunities. But it definitely is going to require both near-term and longer-term action. And frankly, some things that, as laid out in your 2050 report, are really new and different. But we are definitely going to continue in that same direction.
Great, thank you. And this is going to be my final question before we proceed to audience Q&A. So make sure to submit your questions in the question box if you have any. And something that's come up a lot is that some cost-effective approaches to reducing emissions aren't yet scalable, or what could be or need to be cost-effective. So for example, Bob, you were talking about carbon capture a lot. Sarah, you were talking about various technologies you will need. And of course, Michelle, you talked about the innovation fund that you all are launching. So I'm curious if if each of you could talk in a little bit more detail about how you plan to advance these types of technologies, exploring, forging, supporting them. Is it partnerships with government? Is it working with NGOs in this space? I'm just kind of curious how you plan to actually engage to push these technologies where they need to be.
Well, it's Bob, I'll jump in. I'm sorry, no, please go ahead.
Thanks, Bob. Just a few examples of how we're thinking about this, and I think you'll hear more from us in the months and years ahead. But two initiatives that we're really excited about that are just getting off the ground over the last year, and our partnership with EPRI and the Gas Technology Initiative called their Low Carbon Resource Initiative. We're founding members of that. It's a 5-year effort to advance research and development across many of the technologies that I mentioned, many of which cross the electric and gas sector, hydrogen being a really good example of that, which has implications for both us on the electric side and the gas distribution side of our business. Another initiative that is getting off the ground with Edison Electric Institute that we're really excited about. C2ES is involved in that effort, as well as a number of other nonprofit partners looking at how can we advocate for policies that are going to support those technologies as an industry, and together with many of the stakeholders who also see achieving these goals as really important. And so I think we're looking at this both from an advocacy perspective and getting the policy support that we need, but also from the perspective as how as an industry can we be involved in the research and development to advance these technologies. And we've been involved over the years in projects that have tested various carbon capture solutions and battery storage technologies, and we'll continue to be looking for those opportunities to advance technologies on the ground in addition to providing that advocacy support.
So I'll jump in here. I mean, you mentioned the $1 billion fund, and the best way to understand the landscape sometimes is to announce that you're launching $1 billion fund, and then you get a better understanding of what's there with all the projects that come in. But I think that's where we are right now, to really know what is there. Like $1 billion is a lot of money, but in the scheme of things of what's needed, it's not. And we just see that as kind of, this is at least us beginning to figure out is there really good potential for us to be able to take those things that are being already developed and get that to scale and to market. But there's another important lever that Microsoft has, which is our own procurement. I know Sarah had mentioned this, and that we are a large energy consumer. We use a lot of electricity to power the data centers that make modern computing work. And we have set these goals on renewable energy. Our data centers also need to operate 24/7. And so when we build a data center, we also build backup supply. And so we are doing a lot of development and procurement ourselves on some of these technologies, if it's energy storage or fuel cells, and working a lot with others. In terms of some of our other goals that we've just made in terms of vehicle electrification, we're going to be looking at a ton of other technologies. So I think both the procurement arm as well as the investment arm is going to put us into really close partnership with other companies in the space, and the manufacturers in the space, as well as the labs and the government organizations and NGOs that are working in the space.
And this is Bob, Tom, if you don't mind. You could tell I was eager to jump in earlier because this is something I'm a bit passionate about, because, even if every one of the companies in this panel and all of the more progressive companies who set these strong ambitions were to achieve them, we can't do it on our own. It absolutely requires collaboration across our industries, across the country and the globe. And it's across all the different groups that you mentioned. So it is within and across industries. And good examples of that, I referenced earlier, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative, of which Shell and we and a number of others are part. There's an oil and gas methane partnership, and through those we are not only sort of collaborating and sharing best practices, but also investing in projects like I mentioned, the CCUS project at Teesside in UK, also with ENGOs. And that is a really important area of collaboration, both with respect to operations and also with respect to policy. So we're working closely with the Environmental Defense Fund for example, on getting at the methane issue. And frankly, as our CEO pointed out, the aim we have around increasing measurement of methane emissions is one that we learned about the importance of working with EDF. But the last thing, and I do want to hit this before we move into the general Q&A, is policy. And it gets back to the first thing I said. I think people often, when industry talks about all the things they're doing, they think traditionally that's our way of saying, get off our back, government, we'll do it ourselves. But actually, we need policy to support this. And so that's why I liked when Michelle said earlier, we will use our voice. Well, Microsoft is using its voice, and we're using ours along with Shell and many other companies through groups like the Climate Leadership Council, advocating for federal climate policy and carbon pricing, carbon dividends plan, as well as a group called the CEO Climate Dialogue, and also through dialogues at C2ES. And then finally, in this regard, I think it does mean ENGOs and companies linking arms and working together on good policy initiatives. So in the Northeast right now, we're working with a number of ENGOs to try to introduce the Transportation Climate Initiative to build on the good success of RGGI in dealing with power sector emissions. And non-traditional allies working together, if we're serious about this, collaboration is the only way to actually not only do it as individual companies, but actually create supportive policies that can make net zero be a real possibility.
And if I could just build on that, Tom, because that's an excellent point, Bob. I mean, no matter what any single company does, we definitely need action and policy action to scale to what we need to do. And so as part of our announcement in January, we outlined 4 key areas. I think we've touched one of them amongst us, which is research and development. There's been a lot of money that goes in, more money needs to be done, but it needs to be much more targeted towards outcomes, and we need a lot of more cross-border collaboration on it. On the second piece is, even if you get technology, there's still regulatory barriers for that technology to be able to participate in markets. Case in example right now is energy storage. You can't participate like other types of electricity providers in wholesale markets. So you need to be able to reduce those barriers. The third thing is on these market mechanisms and pricing mechanisms, so that investors and companies and organizations and individuals can accurately reflect the issues about carbon and make more informed decisions. And the fourth area is really having universal standards, uniform standards about how we report and calculate the emissions that go into goods and services, so that we can make more informed decisions about these things, and people can be empowered to do more.
Thank you so much, Bob and Michelle and everyone. You were reading my mind and our audience's mind, because I was going to pivot there to a policy question. So I'm glad you all set that up quite nicely. Before I do that, I do want to acknowledge the many great questions that we are receiving for this webinar. Unfortunately, we will not be able to get to all of them, but we do encourage you to follow up, and we can be helpful and connect when appropriate. So just transitioning right off from that conversation, because of the importance of policy. And I think that's something that's unique and new about some of these commitments, is that there really is a commitment not just to federal policy, but policy at different levels, including internationally and locally. And we received a few questions from representatives from state and local governments wondering what really the role of state governments or local governments is in this, and how they can pass policies, or how you plan to work with local governments to advance policies that are conducive to you meeting these goals.
This is Sarah. Maybe I'll jump in here, specific on the state and local, because as again, a regulated utility, I think this is really important to us. As I said before, we see collaboration with our states and stakeholders is absolutely critical here, and so we see the processes in front of our commissions at the state level is really important, and we'll be having these conversations about how we make this transition through those long-term planning processes and evolving over time as the technology landscape evolves and the market landscape evolves. One good example of where that's happening today is in North Carolina with Governor Cooper's Clean Energy Plan and the stakeholder process, where we're having discussions about how can we accelerate our transition to clean energy in North Carolina. On the state and local piece, I think that's really important. I mentioned at the beginning that until earlier this year, I was focused in our North Carolina jurisdictions, and we had at least 14, I'm sure the number is higher by now, municipalities within our jurisdictions that had set goals to reduce emissions. And we saw those partnerships as really important. To a point that I think Bob made earlier in working with ENGOs, we've been working directly with many of those state and local officials. We have also been participating in roundtables that EDS, which was mentioned earlier, had been convening in North Carolina among different municipalities, trying to understand how their goals relate to our goals and how we can work together. And I think a really good example of where we've made progress is with the city of Charlotte, where we signed an MOU that we would work together on things like how do we bring more renewable energy, how do we electrify transportation in the Charlotte region. And I think really getting outside of our traditional ways that we engage with our customers is going to be really important to us going forward, and really rolling our hands up and rolling our sleeves up, and digging in and figuring out how we can work together. And in some cases, again, as a regulated utility, that might mean going together with some of our municipalities to the commissions and making the case for doing things differently than we've done in the past, where our regulatory frameworks might not have contemplated the types of partnerships that we may want to embark on today.
Yeah,
Great,
this is
thanks,
Bob.
Sarah.
I'll just add, very well said. If that's okay, Tom, just as I wanted to say, I'm really glad for this question, because there is so much important work going on at the state and local and the city level with respect to carbon policy. And I mentioned earlier, pretty exciting set of initiatives in the northeastern states to, well, number one, a couple of those states, Virginia and Pennsylvania, extending the regional greenhouse gas initiative for a cap and trade program for power sector emissions, which has been very successful in extending that into those states, as well as the Transportation Climate Initiative, which would bring a similar cap and trade program for the transport sector, which is a difficult to decarbonize sector, and down the line could create the opportunity for linkage and a much closer to economy-wide program. That is really good carbon pricing policy. In fact, good enough that we have come out, our US Chairman and President Susan Deo, publishing op-eds in favor of it, and we are really working closely with a lot of ENGOs to hopefully bring that into reality. In the Pacific Northwest, we have been very much supporting climate policy in Washington and Oregon, cap and trade programs, and also supported in the state of Washington, the governor and the legislature in setting net zero as a specific goal. Our aim 6, which I mentioned earlier, is actually to more actively advocate for policies that support net zero, including carbon pricing. And many of those policies now are actually being developed at the state level. And one other thing I want to add, and again, reference to Houston here, who just this week or just last week announced their climate action plan, which we also came out publicly in support of, and it's really impressive. And if you think of sort of the Climate Innovation 2050 approach, really taking a systematic look at the energy system for that city at a scale and level that you can understand it. It's very impressive, because it looks at all of the different things and develops specific goals and so on that then will be fleshed out in more specific policies. And we've been working closely with them on that. We really look forward to being part of it. So I think more than ever, you know, states and localities are a critical part of this on the policy level and even on the operational level.
And I'll just add, really, there's been such tremendous work that's been done by the states and the cities, both on carbon and on electricity, which states have a lot of purview when it comes to the regulatory and policy issues. Microsoft has been really engaged in the discussions and conversations that happened in Virginia, with them joining RGGI and 100% clean energy bill that was passed. Same in Washington State, with the various iterations of carbon pricing proposals, as well as the net zero electricity that was passed. What's so exciting about this space is not just that the producers are getting engaged and the developers, but also the customers. And customers really want more renewable and clean energy options. And so I think as states look to the different opportunities that there are, is keeping in mind, how do you create as much choice as possible for customers to be able to access the types of clean energy they need in cost-effective ways that obviously take into account the needs of the grid, but also the needs of the local community.
So a couple questions coming in about the elephant in the room here, which is how our current economic and public health crisis will impact these goals. And are you expecting increased pressure from shareholders or others to cut back on climate plans? And how is your company addressing that difficult balance between addressing the immediate crisis and making sure you're on a path to also addressing the climate challenge? And Bob, maybe we'll start with you because you talked about this at the beginning.
Yes, and look, I mean, we all have to recognize these are very, very tough times. I mean, I think just by the discussion we're having today and the discussion we continue to have within our company and so on about the long term and the midterm, I think that's really important because, as I referenced earlier, there's going to be a lot of rebuilding and a lot of change. And we need to be able to take that into account and still keep our focus on the longer term. We're also seeing, look at what's happening with the oil markets, and there will continue to be a substantial need for oil long into the future. But there are also a lot of changes going on, some of which may be temporary and some of which may be longer term. So this is why I think even on a business basis, we continue to say, and I think, smart shareholders and investors who increasingly are focused on how are you going to deal with the changes upcoming will be supportive of this. And it requires, frankly, a lot of financial discipline too. I mean, we've already, cut our capital expenditure in general by 25%. We are really shoring up our liquidity position. We just announced our earnings, so I can say things like my colleague from Shell could not. And we're targeting some major savings in cost, 2.5 billion by 2021. So we do have to remain a strong and viable business. But I think for the mid and long term, it's still very important to focus on this, and that's why, notwithstanding really having to make a lot of tough decisions to keep the company strong in this circumstance, we are continuing to invest in lower carbon energy and continuing to focus on that as we go forward.
And I would just add, from a Microsoft perspective, I mean, we are steadfast in our commitment. Obviously, COVID-19 is very, very front of mind for our company. At the same time, we continue to make the long-term investments that we need to do on sustainability. Aside from our climate announcement 2 weeks ago, in alignment with Earth Day, we made an announcement on ecosystems and how our ambition to build a planetary computer to help the world manage and measure natural resources, and that we are going to be protecting as much land as we use. And then some public policy areas that we are going to be advocating for in the ecosystem space. And this is part of a broader strategy, not just about carbon and ecosystems, but also about water and about waste. And while COVID-19 is very, very much front of mind, it is the challenge, the planetary challenge that we're facing today, we also look to the future, and we know that in 2030, these sustainability challenges are still going to be with us and going to be the ones that we really have to be concerned about.
Yeah, and this is Sarah. I think all of that was really well said. But what I would just add is that from a utility perspective, I think what the current crisis does for us is just to underscore what has already been a guiding beacon. And for us, as we're thinking about this, in both maintaining affordability and reliability, and I think it just underscores the need as we make this transition to do it in a way that is cost effective from for our customers, many of whom are very price sensitive anyway, especially our low income customers, our energy intensive businesses that have to compete on a global level. So we've had those considerations front of mind going into this, and I think they'll just continue to be important as we think about how do we make this transition in a way that makes sense for our customers.
Okay, thank you. We also received a few questions, actually several questions about natural climate solutions. And we know the importance of driving finance toward these solutions and the importance of these sinks. So I'm wondering if each of you, or just a few of you, could talk more about your approach to natural climate solutions. For example, if there are specific types of solutions you're prioritize, or how you're prioritizing, or how you're engaging, and why it is important for companies to support these solutions beyond just to offset your emissions.
I'm happy to start. This is Michelle from Microsoft. As we mentioned, as part of our carbon negative, we do have this carbon removal goal, and nature-based climate solutions are really the one that is available today to help us address that. Obviously, there are other ecosystem benefits to afforestation and reforestation, or better soil management, and there's also obviously wildfire. There's also livelihood benefits. One of the greatest, the really exciting projects that we've been a part of in the last year has been working with a small startup called Sylvia Terra, and it's been helping them provide the compute power for them to be able to collect on the ground data, match it with satellites, and in real time be able to do a census of every tree across the United States. And then with that information, they're able to see what the carbon sequestration potential is of certain batches of forests and certain trees. And so we were then able to work with them in a community in Pennsylvania to be able to go to some landowners and to be able to offer them, to be able to pay for the carbon sequestration that they were able to do in a year or 2 years or 5 years, and to be able to really measure that. So we were able to get both the carbon sequestration benefit of that, but also be able to provide livelihood and a different option besides cutting down or preserving and not getting paid. And so there are so many different knock-on effects of the nature-based solutions, both in the environmental and the carbon side, as well as in the overall livelihood side. So it's a very exciting piece. It has to be verified. It has to be measured, which is what's exciting for us about a lot of the data solutions that are coming available. And it's only one piece of this. We need to do a lot of the reduction efforts and a lot of the other things to address climate, but it is definitely part of the solution.
I think that's very well said, and I'll just jump in to say, yes, we've been active, certainly in terms of natural climate solutions. We have a large environmental credits business that invests in many of those projects, and we also have our target neutral business. As I mentioned, they working with Flora and Fauna International develop the projects that we will use to offset the donation we just made of fuel. But the other point I want to make is on the policy side, because I think for this to really scale at the level that it needs to, I think it's also really important that there be good, strong policies, as we talked about, defining the validity of credits and so on, but also hopefully including those as part of a carbon pricing program. And that's certainly something we advocate for. I mean, it's said that natural climate solutions could provide maybe 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions reductions needed by 2030 to get on the goal to Paris. Now, that's a very ambitious goal, but it is going to require policy. And the last thing I'll say on that is it just comes back to this continual theme that we mentioned of collaboration. So we are working very closely with a number of ENGOs, including the Nature Conservancy, Conservation International, and others, to help develop the methodologies and so on to make sure that these natural climate solutions can actually be scaled in a way that will be valid and then can be used as part of a policy program.
Great, okay. So probably moving on to our last question here, unfortunately. And again, thank you for all of your questions, and we look forward to continuing to engage with the audience. But to finish up here before closing statements, can panelists speak to the level of engagement at the employee level, right? We've talked a lot about how companies are engaging with communities, with other NGOs, government, other companies, et cetera. But what is this actually looking like internally? How are there efforts to engage employees in sustainability? How are you incorporating employees across diverse departments, legal, finance, engineering, to be a part of this process?
So I can start. This is Michelle. Obviously, it's an explicit principle in how we are going about achieving and executing our carbon negative goal. We have a very, very robust employee engagement. A lot of it is organic in that they're excited about this and passionate and constantly sending us ideas, and they share a lot of ideas amongst themselves, both the group of employees that has this as their direct job and the group of employees that wants to be involved regardless of what their job is. So we have hackathons, we have a lot of back and forth, both formal and informal, to be able to really tap that resource, because as I said earlier, they have so many ideas of how to, organize Microsoft, what we could do on our campus, technology, how we can engage customers. So we really want to be able to tap into what they're doing and what they know.
And this is Sarah. I would just add, similar to what Michelle said, the process of setting our goals involved a lot of employees. Is truly a team effort from across the company. Our resource planners, our representatives from all of our state jurisdictions, legal, federal policy. There was just a huge effort that really came together in looking at those goals. And similarly, as we have been pulling together the climate report that was just published yesterday, and the analyses as we're thinking about how do we get there. So there's a lot of organic opportunity where we're involving people from across the company. We also have processes like our sustainability core for employees across the company who are interested in how they can help make Duke Energy more sustainable, and diversity and inclusion councils that deal with a whole host of issues that are near and dear to employees' hearts. And so there are just a lot of opportunities, and certainly employee sentiment and what employees would like to see the company engaging on is certainly a big part of how we're thinking about the path forward.
So this is Bob, just building on that quickly. I think that's well summarized by both. And I'll just say that, when this was announced in February, employees are just very, very excited about it. Obviously, some of them wanting to know the details, how is this going to affect our future and so on, but in general, very, very excited about it. But what has impressed me even more, I think, is how in the wake of a very, very difficult oil market, obviously, that we've been faced, and a double whammy with quarantining and COVID and the impacts that's having on people, leadership is really important. And our CEO regularly does, from his home, talks to the employees about what we're dealing with on all different levels in an empathetic and understanding way, but also continues to talk about why this is important, that this ambition we've set for net zero by 2050 is the right path, and why we need to continue on that path. And that continues through the organization. So that's really important. And then the other thing is, this is very, very complex, obviously, on every level. So I think operationalizing it and actually getting the people who turn the valves, or the people in our onshore who are working on these sites where we're trying to control methane emissions, trying to get them involved. And they'll also have a lot of ingenuity and ideas for how we can manage and mitigate emissions. So I think that's also really critical, that you have this isn't just sort of the corporate headquarters setting off lofty themes. It's actually being driven through the organization in a disciplined way, with metrics like Michelle was talking about are so important ultimately across industry, and that it is pursued just like any other business activity, but also bringing together that sense of this is purposeful activity. We are all citizens of the world and employees of this company. We want to do this, and that continues.
Great, thank you, Bob. With that, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to provide some quick final remarks on key takeaways, next steps, or anything else that they'd like to leave the audience with. To give them a few seconds to gather their thoughts, I'd like to first thank each of our speakers for taking the time to participate in the webinar today. Thank you as well to our audience for your participation, attention, and questions. And we look forward to continuing to work with all of you on this important topic. With that, I'm going to hand it back to Sarah to close it off.
Thanks, Tom. I'd just like to thank you, Tom, and C2ES and everyone who has joined us today for inviting us to be part of today's event. This has been a really great discussion. I am incredibly appreciative of the opportunity to participate. I know I've learned a lot just from hearing from others and from the great discussion today. I think the one thought I would leave you with is to emphasize that this is a journey and one on which we're all going to need to adapt and evolve over time. Bob mentioned the recurring theme of collaboration. And so as we move forward on the journey and knowing that there will be both challenges and opportunities along the way, some of which we can foresee and others that might surprise us, I would just encourage us all to keep talking together and navigating our way forward together, because it's really going to take that collaboration to get there.
Thank you, Sarah. Certainly agree. Bob?
Yeah, so I'm just thinking about themes, and obviously we've talked a lot about collaboration. I'm going to mention that one more time because the number of people we have on this call from all different sectors and from civil society, NGOs, business, policymakers, thought leaders, I think sort of breaking the paradigm, moving beyond sort of polarization, which we're all facing right now, into a truly, collaborative mindset, I think is extremely important. Innovation, we've talked about a lot across all these different areas, not closing off any individual path, looking at them all. And then the other thing I think is organization. So I think how companies organize themselves, are they customer focused? Michelle mentioned that. I think that's so important. And one of the reasons we've moved away from the old upstream and downstream, but how you're organized to do that. And then, the last thing I'll say is that, if you think about it, and I think a lot of people really are, as we're quarantined in our homes, there is a lot of similarity between the problem we face right now, although hopefully that is one that, we'll have a vaccine and we'll move past it. But recognizing the science, making tough decisions and so on can make a difference, and we're all in it together. So I think that hopefully coming out of this, that spirit will help us, get to these really important goals that we need to for all of us.
Thank you, Bob. Michelle, you get the final word.
Thank you, Tom. I am just struck at how constructive and positive this conversation is, and just how much these types of conversations have evolved in the last 10 years, 5 years, but even in the last year. And so I think we need to be sober about the huge challenge that is ahead of us on this issue, both in terms of the size, the scale, and the speed at which we need to act. But at the same time, there's a bit of optimism here that maybe when a company like Duke and a company like BP and Shell and Microsoft can put these kinds of plans forward, working with everybody that's on this phone, with our customers and our governments and our organizations and civil society, we just might be able to address this challenge.
Thank you very much. That concludes our webinar. Make sure to continue the conversation by following and tweeting at us at C2ES_org on Twitter. From the entire C2ES team, we wish you safety and good health. Take care and goodbye for now.